The Second World War had profound impacts on American society. Edward Shrager, who was born in 1938 and grew up during the war, experienced these firsthand. This interview serves to investigate, through his experiences, the effects of the Second World War on the American home front.
Okay. I was born August 29th, 1938, in Norwalk, Connecticut. My earliest memories are of my home at 23 Melbourne Road. I remember my father's dog. My parents were in the process of getting a divorce, beginning in about I was born in 38, so 3 or 4 years. I knew there was a lot of unhappiness in the family, so I remember standing in a crib, and my father walked in, and he was very upset, and I sort of knew why, because I guess they had told me that they were not going to be together anymore, so that was very upsetting at a young age. And my mother had moved back to the house where my grandmother lived, which to her was an absolute disaster because she wanted her own family, her own house, and all that. My brother Peter had already been born in 41, so he was very young. But nevertheless, my father was working at a defense factory in Bridgeport. He was not drafted in the Second World War. He was very young. I was born when he was 17. So he was extremely young. But he had an ulcer, so he was not drafted. My uncle, on the other hand, was a lawyer, and he was sent to Europe, where he was worked as a lawyer with the Army, with the U.S. Army. My other uncle, Leo, was a dentist in town and was really too old at that point to be drafted. So I grew up with some, in the early years, I grew up with some knowledge of the war.
Yeah. So what do you remember about World War II?
What I remember about World War II was that, first of all, I knew about the war. And since I read at an early age, I would say I was reading maybe at 5. So by 1943 or even 42, I had seen enough pictures to know that there was a war, that early on things were not going well for the United States, and but I was aware that there were things happening in Europe, and that was also a fascination with me, because later on I was to go into ROTC and to be part of a military way of life, let's say, at a very early age. I was in junior ROTC, and served in the service myself. Well, of course, in 1960 I started that. But during the war, I was very aware of the airplanes bombing. My second cousin was my third grade teacher. That was my mother's first cousin, Gert Stahl. So I used to draw pictures of planes, and I knew that what the planes looked like because I read the newspaper, and I was able to read at a very young age. Not as good as my brother, but because he was like a photographic memory, but I was quite aware of what was going on. So I was aware there was a war. I was aware that it was Germany and Japan. Both fascinated me very much. And to the extent I could, as a youngster, I tried to read as much as I could, because there was no TV in our house at that point anyway. I came in 48, so
yeah.
I hope that is that enough, or?
Yeah, so we can keep going a little bit. How did the war affect your family?
Well, it really, other than my Uncle Richard going to war and being away from his wife, Lillian. I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little. Will you just repeat the question? question?
Yeah, no problem. How did the war affect your family?
Okay, so my uncle served in the war.
Yeah.
But quite frankly, my grandfather became ill in 1941, which I was 3. I remember him lying on the couch, and Richard was off to war already, and my grandfather was dying of cancer, so it was very painful to see him, in that situation. But frankly, then, the war did not affect my family very much at all.
Huh. Wow. So, how did
my father was in a defense factory in Bridgeport.
Yeah.
And at that point, he met another woman. So things got very, very complicated in the family, obviously.
Yeah.
And that was not good for me. But I did meet them. He took me to Bridgeport shortly after he left the house and introduced me to the family there. And those were the people that he was working with in the defense factory, one of whom became his second wife.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how did food rationing during the war affect you, your family, your neighbors, anyone you knew?
Well, not very much. Because my grandparents, particularly my grandmother, was very resourceful, coming from Europe. She was extremely resourceful. And having formerly owned a grocery store, I think they gave that up in about 1935. But my grandfather got sick, and I think they gave up the grocery store, but kept groceries, that they didn't sell. I think they put them in the house. So in effect, I remember in the basement of the house, there was all kinds of groceries, cans of things, and it was perfectly legal to have them. It's just you couldn't buy them. That was the thing because of the rationing. So I remember seeing the ration coupons. I remember my grandmother and my mother talking about these things. My grandmother really was running the house. My mother was very, very unhappy going through a divorce. It was very unhappy for her. It was very difficult for her to face. And she never really recovered from it. My grandmother, on the other hand, was really a terrific homemaker, beautiful person, just a terrific lady, and really took care of us. And, of course, we were living in our house, and our house was large enough so that we lived well. And I told you about that story in the basement, which, is very much a war story, So we can talk about that later or now, whenever.
Yeah, maybe can you talk about it now?
Yeah. So meat was a problem, and the family were big meat eaters. You needed ration coupons for meats, and it was very hard to get. So my grandmother, being, as I said, very resourceful, I remember there was a dirt cellar. The dirt cellar was part of the walls of the cellar that had been chopped away when they built a porch subsequent to the building of the house. The house was built probably in 1925, I would say, and then it was added onto, and underneath the porch was a crawl space. And my grandfather or somebody had chopped a hole in the wall so that you could actually go underneath the porch. And in that area, which was a dirt cellar, it was like dirty, there was a whole mess of chickens that my grandmother was raising all the time, Yeah. And you didn't need a rooster, you just needed chickens that were, laying eggs, and they just keep laying eggs, pretty much on and on. Unless you didn't take the eggs out, but as long as you took the eggs out, then the chickens would keep making eggs. So I remember that. I remember picking the eggs up and putting them in a basket. They were brown eggs, and I remember taking them upstairs, and then my grandmother would make them, and they were just so delicious. Eggs that were just freshly hatched every single day. It was unbelievable. I know the chickens were fed, and occasionally I did help feed them, but the thing that really stood out in my mind was when there was a need for like a a party or something, you know, where people would come over, and then my grandma would kill the chicken, you know, one of the chickens. And then I told you how the chicken, you know, she would take a dull hatchet and smash the thing in the head, and eventually the head would come off and the chicken would run around and die. Yeah. So that was pretty bloody, blood all over the place. And she would clean it up, and we'd do it again a few days later. She was buying chickens. You could actually buy chicks. You could do that, yeah. That wasn't covered by ration coupons, but you needed a place to raise them. So my grandmother made that place, and so we always had chicken. And that's a good meat, you know. It's a really good meat. Yeah. So to this day, I love chicken.
Wow. That's very interesting. And are there any other sort of things that you got out of growing up during wartime that you realized about yourself? Any other stories or pieces of information?
Well, I was fascinated with warplanes. My you know, playing was with toy planes and stuff like that, and military gear. And I became wrapped up in the war. And watched us, you know, watched the pulse of it change. We had no relatives that I know of that were affected with concentration camps or anything like that, although, as you know, I learned later on that my grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother, your great-great-great-grandmother, Liba, was in Romania and escaped the Nazi concentration camps because the Nazis were simply not interested in Romania, particularly because they knew once the war was over that they would, of course, win the war, and that Romania would then give them all the Jews, and you know. But I didn't know that then, and frankly, I didn't know that till many, many years later. Frankly, I didn't know that till recently. So my sister Jo, you know, visited the grave of my great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother in Romania, and saw her picture. Which we'd never seen. It was never seen before. You see, she had. This is my paternal grandfather's mother, who actually lived many, many years. She lived close to 100, and she had three children. We don't know whether the third was a son or a daughter. We're not even sure, but we know the first two were boys, and they came to the United States. Maybe in 1915 to 1920, paternal grandchildren. So, a paternal grandfather. So, and maybe earlier, actually. I'm not sure exactly when. But Liva lived in Romania till her death.
Wow. Well, that's all very interesting. That's really great. Thank you very much for this amazing information. It all sounds really very interesting. So are there any other stories or anything else you can remember? If not,
yes. Always the German planes, reading about Messerschmitts and Fokkers. Mm-hmm. Those were the names that were in the newspapers, and, you know, I made it my business to be able to pronounce them and to understand them. And then, of course, the Royal Air Force in Great Britain, and then the American Air Force. But I was particularly respectful of the soldiers who, you know, didn't have any machines. And I remember reading about the Battle of the Bulge and Dunkirk before that, and learning about what happened. It was very fascinating because there was a lot of geography involved, and I was always very good with maps and trying to study where things happened. I would read about them, and then I'd look at a map, and you know, there were maps. I mean, there were newspapers, and there were diagrams, so you could see the progress of the war, and then you could see. I certainly remember the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I remember the Japanese caricatures, you know, in the newspapers of being, you know, barbarians and things like that. I remember a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I feel